Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. And I'd like to talk to you about a very important mission that we have at Immunovia, which is saving lives through the early detection of pancreatic cancer with a simple blood test. Immunovia is a very different company than what some of you may know if you have followed the Immunovia story. And we are a very different company from the company that we were just a year ago. We are now a lean development stage company that has key assets to develop and launch an early detection test for pancreatic cancer. As we'll discuss today, we have made significant changes to our leadership team and significant changes to our organization. We have a very promising research and development program that has made progress in developing our next generation test, and I'm excited to share with you some of the early results of those efforts. As we move forward, while we are a very different company from what we have been in the past, we also have assets that we take with us as a result of the experience that we have in this field over many years. One of those assets is a large biobank of blood samples from more than 8,500 patients who have pancreatic cancer or are relevant controls. And we'll talk about how that is fueling our R&D program. We also have strong and productive relationships with key opinion leaders as a result of the work that we've done in the pancreatic cancer space to lead this effort over the past several years. And at the end of the day, we believe that these assets and the new infusion of talent that we have will be exactly what the company needs to meet the significant unmet need in pancreatic cancer for a simple blood test. I mentioned that we have made significant changes to the personnel of Immunovia. I joined the company about 2 years ago and became the CEO just about a year ago in May of 2023. Part of my mission has been to staff the organization in a very different way. Today, we are a much smaller company. We have fewer than a dozen employees, and we are leveraging outside experts, consultants, and contractors to bring in that expertise when we need it, but to preserve our cash and to make sure that we're operating in a way that is as efficient as possible. That said, we do have critical employees who are driving the company forward. You can see some of our leaders on this slide. They are people who have worked in both very large companies where they have learned best practices and bring expertise to the company, but they've also worked in small entrepreneurial cash-strapped organizations. And that experience and that balance is really critical as we move forward. I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the opportunity and the addressable market for the test that we're developing. The market for early detection of pancreatic cancer in high-risk individuals is large and it's growing. The figures that you see on this slide are for the US market, which is our first market that we plan to go after. There are about 1.8 million people that are at high risk for pancreatic cancer. And frankly, that's a conservative estimate that really acknowledges the fact that we will try to get those people when they are most receptive to us. The actual number of people who are at high risk is even larger than that. Our initial focus is going to be on those people who are at high risk of pancreatic cancer because of either family history or because of genetic mutations that they have. And we know that there's a tremendous opportunity there. More than 4 out of 5 of those people today are not in regular surveillance to make sure that they catch the pancreatic cancer early. And as I'll show you in just a moment, that's really a problem. While the market is large, it continues to grow. It is one of the few markets in oncology where the at-risk population is growing so significantly. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is that more people are being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, putting more of their family members at risk. And the second reason is the continued explosion of genetic testing, which continues to identify more and more people who are at risk. There's a strong unmet need in pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer has somewhat been left behind by all of the advances in oncology that you've seen in other spaces. As a result of that, pancreas cancer, while a fairly rare cancer, is now the third leading cause of death in cancer in both the US and in Europe. The reason for that is the incredibly low 5-year survival rate of just 13%. And the reason that the survival rate is so low is because pancreatic cancer, the vast majority of the time, is diagnosed too late. As you can see on the right side of this screen, 4 out of 5 people who are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer don't get diagnosed until stage 3 or 4. Only 1 on 5 patients gets diagnosed at stage 1 and 2, and that has dramatic impact on their opportunity to survive. A patient who's diagnosed at stage 3 or stage 4 has only a 3% chance of living for 5 more years. Conversely, if a patient's diagnosed at stage 1 and 2, which is our focus with our early detection test, the likelihood of surviving 5 years jumps to 44%. How are we going to meet this need? What are we developing? We are developing a simple blood test that will allow us to detect pancreatic cancer at stage 1 and 2 to bring more people into high-risk surveillance, to make it easier for them to do that. Today, if you want to get screened annually for pancreatic cancer, you have to go in for imaging, which can often last multiple hours and is rather unpleasant. We believe that a simple blood test will increase compliance, and it will also enable us to test people more frequently than what they are tested today. And as we have seen with the launch of our first generation product, IMMray PanCan-d, you've got strong opportunities to deliver against that market need, and our initial results from an R&D standpoint suggest that we can do it. I mentioned the assets that we bring to this effort. One is a significant biobank of samples that we can use in our clinical studies. The thing that I'd highlight here is that we have nearly 400 samples of stage 1 and 2 pancreatic cancer cases. Those are incredibly rare samples. That's an asset that we have that others in this space simply can't match. A second advantage that we have is the strength of the relationships that we have with key professors, key cancer institutes, both in Europe and in the US, where they are doing leading research in pancreatic cancer. This gives us an opportunity to get great advice on the development of our next product. It allows us to tap into that network when we need to do clinical studies. And these are the same people who will be educating the market when we're ready to launch the test later in 2025. As I mentioned, we're a development stage company. We have completed our discovery study, which enabled us to identify a number of really promising biomarkers to identify pancreatic cancer. You see on this chart the top 15. I won't go into all the details, but essentially we did an analysis to look at over 3,000 proteins, the largest study of proteins in pancreatic cancer that's ever been done as far as we know, and looked at the ability of those biomarkers to distinguish cancer from controls. Basically, people who have pancreatic cancer from those who don't. The numbers that are in green here reflect places where we saw a statistically significant difference for that biomarker. So you can see in a variety of populations, we're identifying compelling biomarkers that have the ability to detect pancreatic cancer early. This is from the same discovery study. The chart here is what's called a ROC curve, and essentially it's a measure of accuracy. What you see in the chart is this sort of current standard in pancreatic cancer, which is a test called CA19-9. That's the black line in this curve. And the area under the curve is essentially a measure of accuracy at 87%. What you see as you go up and to the left are 2 sample models that we put together. These aren't the final tests that we will go to market with, but they're just an example of the type of opportunities we have to use those 15 biomarkers that I talked about in our next generation test to deliver accuracy that, instead of being in the mid-80s, is in the 90% range, and in some cases, the high 90% range. We are currently working through the next phase of our R&D process, and we expect to finalize the markers and lock the algorithm, releasing results about our accuracy early this quarter. So we should release those results soon. We're excited about the fact that we see a market that is large, that's growing, that's very attractive, and yet it is a market that has not attracted a lot of competition. Most of the market for early detection in cancer is focused on colorectal cancer and on lung cancer. There are just a couple of companies that are focused on pancreatic cancer. We believe that our test offers compelling advantages there. There are also companies that are focused on detecting multiple cancers at the same time. We believe that those tests simply won't be accurate enough for pancreatic cancer because the sensitivity of their tests is simply not good enough for a cancer that's this deadly. Here's an overview of the process that we are going through and where we are in that process. As I mentioned, as you look here right in the middle of the slide, we are currently wrapping up the definition stage of our development effort. That will allow us to lock in our test model. We will finalize the biomarkers that will be part of the test, and that'll give us our first really clear estimate of the sensitivity and specificity of the test. Essentially, can we detect cancer when it's there? And do we not provide false positives if there's no cancer in that patient? From there, we'll move on to analytical validation, where we will establish that we have reliable, repeatable tests that accurately measure the proteins that we're looking to measure. And then from there, we'll move on to the clinical validation, which is essentially another validation that says, yes, we are able to differentiate cancer from those without cancer in pancreas cancer. As you go further out into 2025, we will enter the commercial phase. The most important thing that we'll do early in 2025 is conducting additional studies in order to secure reimbursement for the test. We know that that is the critical element that will make our commercialization efforts successful. We need private payers, commercial payers, government payers to say, yes, we will cover this test. The key to getting that acceptance is additional clinical studies. And fortunately, we have multiple clinical studies essentially designed and ready to go with those thought leaders that I talked about earlier, those professors that are at leading centers. In 2025, we will also look to secure a commercial partner. We believe that that's the best way for us to bring the test to market. And we look forward to launching the test in the back half of 2025. In summary, I hope that you come away from this presentation realizing a few things. First, that there's a tremendous need for early detection in pancreatic cancer, and that need can be met by a blood test as long as that test is accurate enough. I hope you also took away the fact that we've put together the right team and have the right assets to develop that test, to conduct the clinical studies that we need to prove that it works, and to bring it to market. Those are assets that we've accumulated over a number of years, and it essentially allows us to take advantage of the experience and expertise of Immunovia while recognizing that we are a very different company than we were in the past. We are more cost effective, we're operating in a more efficient way, and we're able to get to our goals much faster because of the skills and talents of the people on our team and because of the experience that we have in the space. So look forward to questions and certainly hope that we can share additional information that clarifies the opportunity with Immunovia.
Thank you for that interesting presentation, Jeff. Have a few questions. The The first test that Immunovia developed raised some questions when it came to specificity and sensitivity. And as I remember, there were concerns that the test would not be sufficient to rule out pancreatic cancer. And therefore, patients needed to do an MRI scan either way. Do you believe the new test will be sufficient to rule out pancreatic cancer on its own?
You know, I think really what we see throughout the diagnostics market is that these tests are used to identify people who have the signs and symptoms of cancer, and then you see the additional diagnostic steps happen after that. So we would envision that our test would lead to something that's called an endoscopic ultrasound, which is a fairly invasive procedure, but that allows people not only to visually see the cancer, it allows them to take a biopsy, and in some cases, that's really going to be critical in order for them to understand whether surgery is an option. So we envision this as something that will provide very good clarity that would then be followed up with something like an endoscopic ultrasound.
All right. And there's a balance between specificity and sensitivity.
Absolutely.
But which of the two do you prioritize the most?
You know, as you said, we have to deliver both, but at the end of the day, specificity is really important in pancreatic cancer. Specificity essentially means that we're not generating false positives. We're not saying that someone has cancer when they don't. The reason that's so important in pancreatic cancer is that it is a low incidence cancer. And so we know that the average person that we test, even if they're high risk, will not have pancreatic cancer. We can't create a bunch of false signals because then that puts that patient through a bunch of procedures after that to either confirm or discount the fact that that patient has cancer. And so given the choice between the two, we will have to make sure that there's absolutely no question about the specificity of the test.
And as I remember, the last test never reached reimbursement in the US. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And were you surprised by that?
You know, I was not surprised. And the reason for that is, you know, reimbursement in the US market is really driven by the number of clinical studies that support the use of a test. We had a very good clinical validation study that showed the accuracy of the IMMray PanCan-d test. Unfortunately, that was really the primary published study that we had. We didn't have this collection of studies showing the effectiveness of the test, showing its accuracy, showing how it could be used clinically. Because of that, the payers that we met with were interested. They were intrigued by the idea. Some of them said, yes, we'd like to work with you to study this further, but we're not ready to reimburse it because you've only got that one study. That's why it's really critical that we've already outlined plans. We've already got studies designed, and we already have partners lined up to execute research with us. And we'll be sharing details about that in coming months. But we will have multiple studies with this test, and that's really what makes the difference in reimbursement.
And can you say something about the price point? Because the last test, as I remember, was about $4,000. Can you say something about the new one?
Yeah, no, so in the US, we did have a price for the test that was $897. That was the price that was set by the US government for reimbursing the test. That would have been the rate that we would have received from government payers, and then commercial payers would pay something probably a little bit different, but relatively close. I would envision that with the next generation test that we're developing, the price of that test will be somewhere relatively similar to that 900 US dollars, or around 9,000 Swedish krona.
And the new generation test, does it give an answer 100% of the time? Does it work for everyone?
So the new test is designed to not have one of the limitations that we had with IMMray PanCan-d. IMMray PanCan-d was very reliant on one of the biomarkers in the test called CA19-9. It's actually a pretty good biomarker by itself, but the reality is that it has a limitation. And the limitation with CA19-9 is that about 10% of the people in the population don't produce it at all because of a genetic difference. That genetic difference leads to an even higher percentage of people who don't produce CA19-9 in certain groups like those of African ancestry. Because of that, with our next generation test development, we're focusing on how do we make sure that even if the test incorporates CA19-9, we're still able to produce a result for those patients who don't produce CA19-9. And so we really believe that that'll enable us to provide a result across the full range of patients, across races, across ethnicities, and really be able to meet that full market need.
And as you've mentioned, you've made the major changes to your management and board of directors. And
Yes.
have you also made an extensive change when it comes to the number of employees and the ones who are employed?
We have, and admittedly that was difficult to do, but it was the right thing to do. We have decreased the number of employees that we have at Immunovia from well over 60 a little over a year ago to 11 today. We know that that was difficult, but the reality is we had to become a more cost-efficient company. We had to reduce our cash burn rate. And so we figured out ways to operate in a way that is much more lean, much more agile, and allows us to achieve the goals that we need to.
And you've been with the company for quite some time. How long have you been there, and where did you work before?
Yeah, so I've been here about 2 years. I came from Myriad Genetics, where when I was at Myriad, I was the chief marketing officer for about a year over all of Myriad's portfolio of products. And then prior to that, I was the general manager for the mental health business at Myriad Genetics. So that was a high growth business that was an entrepreneurial standalone company. I was part of the management team of that company before we were acquired by Myriad, and then stayed on after we were acquired, really to run that business over the few years after that.
And do you see a possibility that maybe the new generational test can be developed even more to other indications and other cancer forms?
I think that the approach that we're taking could be applied to other cancer forms. I think the test that we're developing will be specific to pancreatic cancer. But the reality is there are a lot of different opportunities in pancreatic cancer for different high-risk groups. And so we see that as something that has a very long runway. For example, one of the things that we are partnering with one of our key opinion leaders on is the use of artificial intelligence to go in, look at electronic health records, and identify people who might be at high risk of pancreatic cancer, even though they don't fit the standard definitions of someone who has a family member who died of pancreas cancer, for example. Those artificial intelligence algorithms are getting increasingly powerful. And our opportunity there is to be able to work with those institutions to use our next generation test for all of those patients who have been flagged as having a higher risk, but where it wouldn't make sense to do any kind of imaging because it's too uncertain as to whether they have that. So we see tremendous runway in pancreatic cancer, and that's certainly our focus. We're very committed to meeting that need. We see it dramatically when we talk to the people who are at high risk, and we've got a commitment to give them a better solution.
And thank you, Jeff, for being with us and presenting Immunovia. And we look forward to the results that will be presented soon.